"Don't get in the car," the girl whispered. Those 3 words stopped a revolving door of fortune from swallowing a life. In a driveway ringed by clipped hedges and marble pillars, where the air smelled of lemon oil and expensive perfume, a small figure in worn sneakers watched a black sedan idling beneath a wrought iron gate. She did not belong in that circle of power. She was the maid's daughter, 12 years old, with palms rough from washing up and ears trained to hear what others assumed she could not. Her name was Maria. Her mother, Sophia, had ironed shirts for a man who shaped skylines and stop quotes. The driver, whose hands were supposed to steer only cars, had a plan hidden in the glove compartment that read like a map to ruin. In a few minutes, you would see how a whispered warning altered a chain of events and forced a billionaire to face what his empire had long overlooked. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you are watching from right now, and subscribe to follow more stories where small voices change huge rooms. Now, return with me to that morning when a child on the curb held a truth that no security camera saw. The house sat like a monument to decisions that were never questioned. Marble steps caught reflections of suits moving like slow fish through polished halls. The kitchen, where Maria spent her earliest mornings, was warm with steam and the scent of stale coffee. Pots clanged. A radio hummed old cumbia. Sophia moved with practiced speed, folding linen like quiet prayer, smoothing collars the way people smoothed futures for those they loved. Maria learned to read the edges of life by watching hands. Her grandfather had been a battalion sergeant who taught her about observation and patience. He had pointed to the small things, he said. They carried the intentions of the big. She learned to count footsteps, to notice the smell of oil on a coat, to listen for the peculiar rhythm of a lie. The mansion had rooms layered in velvet and glass, and the sounds of decisions being served on silver trays. Outside, the city breathed diesel and vendors shouted names into the morning. The contrast was a daily lesson. Opulence perched above ordinary hunger. Maria had known both. She remembered the heat of a cramped apartment where Sophia mended shirts by lamplight, and the cold of the marble foyer where a man named Elias Hawthorne, the billionaire, sipped tea and spoke of expansion as if the world were a chessboard and people were pieces. Those memories were a ledger of feeling and duty. They shaped how she looked at a glove compartment filled with maps and notes and the seed of a choice no one expected from someone so small. It began with an errand that was supposed to be ordinary. Maria had come early to polish the driveway lamps, a task she did so Sophia could get a few more minutes of rest before the long day. The driver, Marcus, had always been polite in a way that smelled faintly of cologne and secrecy. Today, he had a new urgency in his step, a stiffness in his shoulders that turned his neck into a set of telegraph poles. He unlocked a glove compartment, and the wind lifted a paper that fell like a confession. Maria saw it because she had been taught to look where others looked away. The paper was not a grocery list. It had names, numbers, coordinates, and a simple plan. It mapped routes and times and mentioned an address outside the city that did not belong on any delivery schedule. At the top, in careful block letters, someone had written a name that matched a page in Sophia's memory tape. Elias Hawthorne. Her stomach tightened. What was a driver doing planning routes that would take him away in the middle of the day with one of Elias Hawthorne's cars? Maria crouched behind a potted ficus, feeling soil on her knees and hearing the echo of her own breath. A delivery truck coughed nearby. A dog in the neighbor's yard barked a single, long, lonely note. The scent of lemon oil from the foyer mixed with the greasy tang of the sedan idling and the metallic flash of a document, its paper edge catching sunlight. She did not have to be told to worry. She had watched Marcus take calls in the garage late at night, phone pressed to his ear like a second pulse. She had seen him make small transactions that looked like hushes. She had heard him laugh too loudly at things that never deserved laughter. Her mind assembled the pieces like a child assembling a puzzle with missing edges. What if it was not just a detour? What if it was a plan to take something or someone away? What if it was a force of extraction disguised as routine? She could not say the words out loud, because what could a 12-year-old say to people who wore monogrammed cufflinks? But she could act. She could warn. She could speak before a key turned. She looked at Marcus and then at the driveway where Elias would step out any minute, sunglasses on, expression sculpted to neutrality. Marcus closed the glove compartment. He walked around the car, slamming the door gently, as if the sound could bury the evidence back under normalcy. The tires whispered against gravel. Maria felt the code of her grandfather clink in her loose teeth. If you knew something was wrong, you did not wait for someone to notice you. You acted. She stepped forward and called, not too loud and not too soft, the voice she used to carry plates across the kitchen and not to upset a room. "Sir," she said. She had never spoken to Elias in more than a nod. He paused, a small tilt of head that registered a child's presence like a pebble dropped in a still pond. He turned. He noticed Sophia in the doorway, eyes hopeful and tired, watching a ritual she had cleaned for decades. Marcus smiled with teeth that did not reach his eyes. "Good morning," he said. The words were a buffer, a practiced civility. Maria saw the moment her whole life had trained her for come into focus. She could tell him to be careful. She could whisper what she knew. She could say something as small and precise as a stitch that would hold the seam of a day together. Maria did not hesitate. Her voice was a thread pulled taut. "Do not get in the car," she said, the words landing plain and sudden against the chrome of the sedan. Silence creased the air. 3 sets of footprints stopped like drums. Marcus blinked, the color leaving his face. Elias looked as if someone had opened a window in a closed room. Sophia's hand went to her mouth. The mansion seemed to inhale. "What did you say?" Elias asked. Maria repeated the warning, and then, because a child knows that adults will demand reason, she told them what she had seen. The paper, the name, the times. The driver laughed first, then anger boiled through his face like coffee spilled. "Who taught you to read other people's business?" he snapped. Elias's voice was low but steady. "Maria, why would you say something if nothing is wrong?" Maria met his eyes. She had learned to look at people and not at their clothes. "Because I read the paper," she said. "Because I saw his phone calls. Because my grandfather taught me to pay attention to what people think is small." There were murmurs from garden workers, a clink of a tray. A neighbor peered through a hedge. For a moment, the world distilled down to 3 people and 1 thin sheet of paper that could not be unspoken. The initial confrontation unfolded like a careful unthreading of fabric. Marcus insisted it was a schedule, a harmless errand, to fix a family cottage outside the city. Elias listened, his jaw a slow metronome. He asked questions that were small at first, then precise. "Who is the recipient?" he asked. "What address?" Marcus answered with the muscle memory of someone who had rehearsed a story. "A client," he said, "a family friend." Elias did not move. Sophia stood beside Maria, hands gripping her apron as if grounding the world. Maria remembered her grandfather's words again and added details he had not known she would think to include. "There were 2 names on the paper," she said, "not client names. Names that match the list of recent transfers in the office. The address is for a safe house in the industrial district." The air tasted suddenly of metal and lemon and the salt of the woman's palms. Elias frowned. He asked Marcus to produce the paper. Marcus hesitated, then reached for his jacket. "You will not go alone," Elias said, his voice that of someone who commanded cranes with a glance. He took out his phone and called the house manager Evelyn and the security chief Thomas. "Secure the driveway," he ordered. "Lock the cars. Nobody leaves until we sort this." Marcus tried to laugh the way someone tries to clear smoke, but the sound was thin. Evelyn arrived with a clipboard and a look that cut like a tile. Thomas, broad and blunt, brought a clipboard of his own and a set of keys and spoke into his walkie-talkie. The moment held itself like breath before a plunge. Maria could not tell if she had done the right thing. She only knew she had acted. Before moving deeper into the events that followed, a quick pause. If you were standing there, what would you do? Would you obey a child who saw behind the curtains? Or would you assume the world outside your fortune was orderly and safe? Díganos comentarios. Would you have stopped the car or would you have trusted the driver? Start your answer with "I would stop" or "I would trust." Your responses help shape how we tell these stories and show how different people answer the same urgent question. Your voice matters here, so write your city and your choice. Now return with me to the mansion where power meets pressure and watch how that single warning unfolded into a confrontation neither side expected. The next hours stretched long and taut. The driver was asked to lay out his route. He presented a clipped version that gave nothing away. Elias requested to inspect the glove compartment. Marcus protested. It became a small courtroom in a driveway, with Evelyn as clerk and Thomas as bailiff. Sophia hovered like someone who could not breathe unless the truth was told. Maria remembered the feel of marble under her palm as she stood by a fountain, watching ripples spread. The security cameras tilted minutely, the lens glass flashing like an unblinking eye. Thomas opened the glove compartment and found nothing but a napkin and an old receipt. Marcus said nothing. He smiled in a way that no smile should be. Elias's assistant Adrian arrived from the office, a man who handled crises with a precise, ledger-like calm. He asked for the vehicle log, and Marcus handed a handwritten page that seemed normal until Adrian saw an indentation on the paper as if something had been removed. He produced a carbon copy and held it up against the light. There, faint but present, were the words and an address. It was an ordinary moment of routine examination that turned into a reveal because someone had left a mark. A small error had become a crack in a plan. Maria felt the gravity of coincidence and care meet in the palm of her hand. Marcus's face changed. He reached for his phone and then dropped it. "Who else knows?" Elias asked. Maria said nothing at first. She did not know the answer, but she suspected that secrets like this were not kept by one person. People hold each other up in silence, and sometimes silence shatters. The first real confrontation between truth and power was not a dramatic televised trial. It was a domestic scene that grew teeth. Marcus was removed from the driveway and asked to sit in the house with the staff lined up like witnesses. Evelyn kept a calm tone that was almost surgical. "We will call corporate security," she said. "We will notify the legal team." Marcus's jaw worked. The chauffeur, who had driven for years and had seen the inside of million-dollar condos and family birthdays, suddenly appeared small. He began to speak, in bursts of anger and then of confession. "I did it for money," he said. "It was never the man in the car." He spoke of threats, of calls in the night, of a folder dropped in an anonymous parking lot with an instruction to drive according to a map for a day, and the promise of a sum that would fix everything for his family. He named names that were not clean. He named a broker named Jamal who did bookkeeping for the estate, and an auditor called Laura who worked at a local paper and seemed to be a friend of his. Maria sat close to her mother and listened, feeling seeds of other people sprout in the room. Jamal, the bookkeeper, with a cigarette behind his ear. Laura, the journalist, with ink on her fingers. Adrian, the lawyer, who wrote emails in the voice of a courtroom. She began to see a web that did not start and end at Marcus. She saw how supply lines could be rerouted and how a car could be a vessel for a transfer disguised as a run to the country. The idea of money moving under the cover of routine was not new to Elias. He had inherited an empire whose arteries were mostly invisible. But what shook him was that his own driver had been offered a route through which something of value might be taken or exposed. The word armadillo was not used, but the feeling was there, like the taste of iron in the mouth. As word spread, allies and enemies assembled. Evelyn called corporate security, and a man named Thomas from Hawthorne Security arrived ready to inventory. Jamal, the bookkeeper, texted frantic messages, which Adrian read aloud and then set aside. Laura, the local reporter who had been friendly to staff and who sometimes smiled in the service hallway, was summoned into conversation not as a friend but as a potential correspondent who could wield paper like a blade. There were more names introduced in passing. Mayor Bennett, who had business ties to a Hawthorne foundation. Dr. Alvarez, a compliance officer who had recently raised concerns about procurement. And a neighbor named Rosa who kept watch over the street from her kitchen window. Each name carried a weight. The story that had begun with a child and a sheet of paper now unfurled into a lattice of motivations and old debts. Marcus, despite his confession, remained a hinge. He spoke of meetings at a diner and an email that had disappeared from a work phone. He mentioned a man named Victor who had negotiated payments in cash and a woman called Naomi who had given him envelopes in exchange for silence. Every new detail made the picture both clearer and more complex. The mansion felt like a stage where backrooms were becoming front and center. The legal and practical steps that followed were precise and methodical. Ehrlich, the corporate counsel, arrived and advised a short list of actions. The safe procedure for evidence preservation was followed. Phones were collected under written chain of custody and placed into sealed envelopes. A digital forensic specialist was called to image Marcus's phone and to preserve data. Marcus was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation began. Corporate security issued a notice that anyone leaving the premises must be escorted. These steps were structured to avoid contamination of potential evidence and to maintain a legal foundation for any later action. The process required documentation at every stage, witnessed signatures, and a log of every item removed. It was a choreography of caution designed to prevent claims of tampering and to ensure that if the case went public, it would stand up to scrutiny in court. The legal explanations slowed the room into the precise rhythm of procedure and placed an order on a chaos that had the potential to feel like panic. For days, the mansion was under a quiet siege. The media smelled something in the air. Anonymous tips went to local reporters. Laura, who had been a neighbor, was approached with an invitation to ask questions. Elias instructed Adrian to prepare statements that acknowledged the incident without inviting speculation. Staff were interviewed. Marcus's account fluctuated between fear and anger. Jamal, the bookkeeper, grew defensive under the glare of questions about accounts that had been shuffled and the curious transfers that lined the margins of a ledger. Small acts of sabotage appeared like crumbs tracing a path. An invoice duplicated, a delivery rerouted, a server log with an odd login time. These were the traces of a plan that had been to move assets quietly through trusted channels. Maria watched the adults parse numbers and motives. She sat in the back of the conference room and folded her hands, feeling the texture of the fabric in her lap and the hum of the air conditioner like a second heartbeat. She listened to Thomas as he explained the meaning of access logs and timestamps, and to Dr. Alvarez as she outlined compliance failures. She heard the word institutional used in sentences like a shield and the word negligence used like an accusation. The house became an institute of slow revelation and fast suspicion. The moment that turned suspicion into action was not an end, but a performance. Maria, who had become an unlikely witness and then a symbol, was asked to recount what she had seen to a small committee that included Adrian, Evelyn, Thomas, Dr. Alvarez, and a special investigator from corporate headquarters named Raymond. This meeting was the first time she had been treated as a bearer of evidence rather than as a background presence. The room smelled of coffee and old paper and the sharp citrus of a cleaner that tried to erase fingerprints. Maria described exactly how the paper had slipped to the floor and how the name had caught her eye. She described Marcus's phone calls and the times when he had driven by a particular warehouse in the industrial district. She named the addresses and read aloud the detail that to an adult might have seemed small. Raymond took notes with a pen that scratched intentionally. He asked clarifying questions, and then he asked the question that turned a listening into a plan. Who else could corroborate this? Maria hesitated, then mentioned Jamal and Rosa and neighbor Laura. She mentioned a memory of seeing an envelope exchanged at the corner of a diner. Raymond listened and then asked the staff to be patient. He said he would check all logs and contact the local authorities if there was any evidence of criminal behavior. It was the first time the machinery of consequence had been explicitly set in motion. Tension rose as the investigation peeled layers off the operation like a serpent shedding skin. Marcus's narrative began to unravel under scrutiny. The forensic imaging of his phone returned metadata that did not match his story. GPS pings that Marcus claimed showed only local running errands actually placed him near the warehouse, at times consistent with the odd transactions in the accounts. Jamal, confronted with discrepancies in the books, shifted between deflection and explanation. He finally admitted to creating a shadow ledger to funnel petty sums to contractors who were in fact shell entities. He implicated a broker who had promised kickbacks in exchange for steering invoices through the plain sight of legitimate expense accounts. Letters and emails surfaced that showed Naomi and Victor negotiating payments and specifying times and vehicles to be used. A pattern emerged in which regular logistical runs served as cover for moving titles or transferring data. The investigators assembled a case in careful layers, building from Marcus's initial confession to forensic evidence that corroborated the route and the recipients. The idea that a car could be used to ferry more than people had been an old corporate trick. The surprise here was not the method, but the scale of complacency it revealed within the house that held a fortune. The public confrontation was scheduled as a statement to clear the house and to show that accountability would be enforced. Elias decided to go to the press, to step into light, rather than cower and let rumor eat the truth. The conference was arranged in a neutral hall. Reporters filed in, and cameras blinked like insect eyes. Laura was present as a reporter now, and not merely as a neighbor. Raymond stood beside Elias and Adrian, and Thomas gave a quiet briefing on what had been collected. 2 officers from the city had been invited to attend to show cooperation. Elias began with a voice that had the calm of someone used to speaking to markets. He acknowledged the breach in trust and credited the staff for quick action and vigilance, making a point to single out Maria and Sophia by name. The room shifted when he did that. Maria felt as if the warm marble of the mansion had been moved into a room filled with glass. She stood beside her mother and felt the eyes of the world on someone who had been invisible for so long. The statements outlined the findings and the steps to be taken. They were precise. They included references to supervised audits to review procurement processes and to bring in an external counsel to investigate further. These were professional phrases meant to reveal accountability and also to reassure shareholders and the public. The technical explanation for how the scheme worked was brief and clear. A shell company had been established to receive transfers for fabricated services. Invoices matched the shell company and were approved by a trusted internal contact. Vehicles and routine logistics were used to move physical media and, on at least one occasion, to carry documents that stripped identifying markers from assets so that titles could be reassigned without immediate detection. The process relied on gaps in oversight and on assumptions that people would not look closely at routine tasks. To preserve chain of custody and to build a case admissible in court, the investigators imaged devices, cataloged physical documents, obtained witness statements, and coordinated with local law enforcement to secure warrants allowing search of related properties. This explanation placed the incident within the mechanics of corporate fraud and clarified the next steps in legal procedure and recovery. When charges were finally announced, the weight of consequence landed unevenly. Marcus faced charges for conspiracy and theft. Jamal was indicted for falsifying records and facilitating transfers. Naomi and Victor were named in subpoenas. The city issued a statement that they would continue to examine ties between local contractors and corporate accounts. A court date was set. Elias, who had been the center of attention, sat through interviews describing the wrong that had nearly happened and the vigilance that had stopped it. For Sophia and Maria, the aftermath felt both public and private. People in the neighborhood nodded when they saw them in the market. Donations appeared anonymously to replace wages lost by staff during the tense days of the investigation. A small foundation run by Elias issued a grant to a local school that Sophia had attended, and the media wrote about the unlikely heroism of a child who had not been taught to speak up. But not everything resolved into neat outcomes. The family inside the mansion grappled with the knowledge that trust had been weaponized and that structures meant to keep an operation efficient could be exploited. The incident sparked a review of policies and a rethinking of how employees were vetted and supervised. It made people ask uncomfortable questions about who benefits when routine conceals malice. The battle for truth had moments of fierce tension where decisions could have changed everything. One such moment came when Marcus, in a last act of defiance, offered to name higher players if granted immunity. The room held its breath. Would the corporation trade prosecution for a list that might point to influential people? There was talk of bargaining and of the danger of letting a small fish slip free to catch a deeper one. Legal counsel debated the cost of a deal versus the value of pressing charges. Elias had to decide whether to offer immunity for cooperation or to pursue full prosecution. The choice weighed both justice and expediency. If they made a deal and names were given, it could lead to a larger net and perhaps more recoveries. If they pressed forward without immunity, they might secure convictions against those directly involved but never reach the architects. Maria watched the adults argue, listened to Adrian laying out legal risks with the precise analogy of a surgeon weighing the removal of a tumor versus the preservation of healthy tissue. She felt the room taste like copper. In a final decision that felt both moral and strategic, Elias chose to seek full accountability through court rather than quick settlements. He believed that letting any complicity be negotiated away would send the wrong message to staff and to the public. The decision was not without cost, and it seeded a longer, messier battle that would test patience and resolve. The climax of the public battle came at a hearing in a city courtroom where testimony from employees and evidence from digital logs, invoices, and bank transfers were laid out like bones on a table. Lawyers argued over intent and over corporate responsibility. Questions were asked about the culture within large houses and large companies and whether negligence had allowed a scheme to flourish. Maria sat in the gallery near Sophia, hands clasped, feeling the wood of the bench smooth against her knees. Witnesses described the smell of lemon oil and the way the marble steps caught sunlight. Someone on the stand described a coffee stain on a page that had become a clue. The case exposed how small acts of oversight or willful blindness could be the pivot on which large wrongs turn. When Jamal took the stand, the exchange was sharp, a sequence of questions and responses that revealed both complicity and fear. The prosecutor made an appeal that combined moral clarity with detailed accounting, while defense counsel argued about circumstantial evidence. The judge listened. For a moment, the courtroom felt like the center of a balance that weighed people and procedure. In the end, verdicts were not immediate. There would be appeals and settlements and continuing investigations. Yet the public exposure itself had a force that reshaped reputations and informed policy. The days after the courtroom that changed a small world were quiet in other ways. Marcus was sentenced to a term that reflected his cooperation and his crimes. Jamal faced penalties and was barred from fiduciary roles. Naomi and Victor fled jurisdiction and were pursued through international cooperation requests. Elias restructured how logistics were authorized and created clearer oversight layers. He also established a scholarship fund in Maria and Sophia's name for local children who showed civic courage in communities where they might feel invisible. The foundation began partnerships with neighborhood organizations and pledged resources to increase transparency in procurement for charities. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress of unexamined routines. It had been altered. People spoke about the incident in tones that shifted from discretion to reflection. Maria found that the world had altered around her. She returned to school where Mrs. Alvarez, her teacher, asked the class to write about an act of courage they had seen. Maria wrote about listening and about the ledger of memory marked by her grandfather. Her writing was chosen for a school display, and the local newspaper ran a piece about a girl in sneakers who had stopped a plan. Her photograph appeared next to the story of the trials and the changes in policy. The public reaction ranged from admiration to cynicism. Some praised Elias for being accountable. Others questioned how such a plan could have almost worked in a house of such resources. The tension between admiration and critique created a conversation about power and responsibility that spread beyond the city. The tension of the climax carried aftershocks long into months that followed. 1 month later, the house was calmer but changed. The staff met for an honest conversation about safety and voice. Sophia received a letter from a foundation offering support for a community class on civic awareness. Maria found that people stopped her to say thank you in the market, and that some children wanted to touch the edges of her sneakers as if they were talismans. She felt awkward with praise because praise implied hero, and hero implied a life changed. But her life had changed. She was offered a place in a local youth program that taught civic leadership and investigative basics for young people. She accepted with the hesitance of someone who did not know how to carry witness and who had been raised to keep hands busy and head down. 3 months later, a small documentary aired on a local channel that focused not only on the scandal, but on the people whose quiet vigilance had made the difference. The footage showed Sophia smoothing a tablecloth and Maria writing in a notebook. In interviews, Elias spoke of the need to institutionalize checks and shared how the foundation would fund audits for other organizations. The story sparked dialogue across the city about trust and the role of staff in high places. There were op-eds and heated talk radio segments, and a civic initiative to offer training for employees in recognizing and reporting irregularities without fear. 6 months after the initial incident, the landscape had shifted noticeably. The scholarship fund had opened its first applications. 2 recipients were children from the neighborhood, and one was a young man who had worked on a delivery route and who had been quietly observant in his own right. The legal case had produced convictions and deterrence and had encouraged companies to tighten oversight. The mansion had become a center for training about integrity in logistical operations and corporate governance. Maria, who had once gone unnoticed in the hallways, was invited to speak at a small panel attended by local community leaders and compliance officers. She spoke simply about looking and about the lesson her grandfather had taught her. She spoke about listening to what people think is small. The room listened and then applauded, and the sound felt like a curtain closing on one chapter and opening on another. What did this change mean in the long arc? Legally, it reinforced the principle that internal actors can be both weak links and sources of accountability. Administratively, it led to mandatory logs, to randomized audits, and to a program that authorized staff to report irregularities anonymously. Socially, it bolstered the idea that a family dynamic can produce courage that challenges systems. For Sophia, it meant a new quality of recognition and small economic relief. For Elias, it meant a humility born from being called to account by the least likely of witnesses. For Maria, it meant a new vocabulary that combined observation with civic responsibility. She used that vocabulary as a scaffold to build programs with the foundation that encouraged young people to pay attention to the small things that matter. The community's narrative shifted from one about a wealthy house untouched by consequence to a story about accountability, about the way a simple voice can cut through layers of assumed order. If there is a lesson here, it is not only that one person can change the course of a morning. It is also that systems require continual attention and that complacency invites exploitation. What would happen if more people were trained to notice and to report? What would happen if organizations created mechanisms that did not punish the messenger? Those are the questions that lingered. The final image of this episode is simple and sharp. A black sedan parked in a driveway, its engine quiet, a small girl's worn sneakers visible as she stepped away with her mother, the sun catching on a paper that had once been a plan and now was evidence. A billionaire found a new measure of what vigilance looks like. A maid and her daughter found a small kind of justice and a place in a conversation about legacy and responsibility. If this story taught anything, it was that the greatest courage often wears ordinary clothes. If this story moved you, subscribe to hear more accounts where ordinary voices reveal extraordinary truths. Share this video and tell us in the comments if you would stop the car or trust the driver and where you are watching from. Remember the last line. Sometimes the loudest truths come in the softest whispers, and sometimes the most important directions are given in sneakers.